And we're live, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Okay, folks, it is 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get back to business here for the afternoon part of our meeting. And I think we should have a quorum here. So anyway, yeah, I think we do. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get started again. And before we get into my understanding is Senator Bonner, co-chairman, you wanted to discuss a bit more about the animal cruelty issue and the carrying those bills forward. If you is there anything you wanted to discuss there, or do we have that covered?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just thought I'd throw it open to the committee as a whole. I think we've done some good work this morning and into the afternoon with clarifying the process and making sure that due process considerations are taken into account in our statutes. There's other things that we could do. I just sent out a personal bill draft I had put together. That would simply kind of reorganize the statutes. I know we've heard complaints about just kind of how disorganized they are. It'd basically just be taking the animal abuse statutes and putting them in a new section and just making it a little bit easier to read with minimal, if any, substantive changes. So there's that out there for the committee's consideration. There's also some discussion as to whether we wanted to have a working group put together made up of folks from the ag industry, as well as I guess animal cruelty or animal rights activists or folks who are concerned about animal welfare, and to sort of potentially get ahead of the inevitable bill or two I think we see just about every year where something terrible happens to somebody's animal and for whatever reason the case isn't pursued, and then we see a bill trying to rectify that. What oftentimes has not been coordinated with those in production agriculture who would be oftentimes affected by a very well-intentioned effort, but one that may not consider everything that all the factors in play. So there's those two considerations. Mr. Chairman, I'll admit I'm satisfied with the work we have done so far. If the committee wants to push it further, I'd just like to have the discussion at least, especially with the working group, if there's some interest in that and kind of going above and beyond and kind of getting ahead of the game there. So that's the only discussion I want to have as we wrap up this topic for today.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Appreciate you touching on that. And so I guess on that note, committee, is there any further discussion on that issue before we move on? Does anyone want to, anybody want to discuss that at all? Okay. Going once. Going twice. And just to clarify, Mr. Co-Chairman, you propose your personal bill that you have for now, you'll hold on to that with considering the what we've already put through this morning.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it seems like if we were just to focus on the policy side of things, maybe we can come back at a later time, or an individual legislator can come back at a later time and worry about the reorganization element when there's fewer moving parts, I would say. But I just put that bill draft out for the committee's consideration, and if there's any input that we have moving forward, feel free to email me or talk to me in weeks and months, maybe even years ahead. We'll see.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. So one more time, is there any interest in further discussion on the animal cruelty topic and the statutes surrounding it? Seeing none. Okay, seeing none. We will move on to our next topic, our final topic for our meeting here, and that is surface damages and water disposal and freshwater sales on state lands. And so with us, we have, I know we have Jennifer Scogan from the State Lands Office and also Jason Crowder. And so we also have Mr. Moline from the Farm Bureau and Senator, Mr. Chairman, Cale Case of Joint Revenue, I believe, is with us. And so welcome everybody. And if Jennifer or Jason want to kick us off, I'll turn it over to you and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Jennifer Scoggin. I'm the Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. With me today, as you mentioned, is Jason Crowder. He's the Deputy Director of OSLI. We'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity today to discuss water disposal facilities on state lands. We provided the committee with a summary report on these sorts of facilities. We also, I believe, the Deputy Director Crowder provided to Co-Chairman Boner a sample of a market analysis that was conducted or provided by an OSLI appraiser, which is linked to a disposal facility that will be constructed in Converse County. Hopefully the committee's had a chance to review these materials. Typically, these facilities are handled under the Board of Land Commissioners rules and regulations under Chapter 5, the special use leasing regulations. And as I mentioned, Deputy Crowder's on the call. He's one of our internal experts on these issues. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield the floor to Deputy Crowder to take the committee through our presentation today.
All righty. Thank you, Ms. Scogan. Yes, Mr. Crowder, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as the director mentioned, we did provide the committee with two documents. The first one being that summary of all the evaporative ponds that we have on state trust lands across the state. And currently there are 14 active leases with ponds that fit this criteria. Now they run the gamut of the size, type, and scope of pond, but they all fit this bucket as far as how we categorize them within our system. As you can see on page 1 of that summary report, that they spread across 7 counties. They cover a little over 800 acres. And since 2013 have returned to the beneficiaries a little over $3.3 million. Of late, we have gotten a lot more applications for larger facilities. And we believe this is due to a couple of reasons. One, the type of oil and gas well being drilled right now has changed in the last few years, meaning that it takes a lot more water to drill these very deep, very long lateral wells. So a lot more water is needed in that process. And secondarily, the idea of using recycled water is becoming more and more popular as the access to fresh water or the just ability to use fresh water becomes limited, and possibly the cost to use fresh water becomes more limited. So we've seen a lot of, not a lot, we've seen a few larger facilities being applied for on state trust lands, over 100 acres or so, several 100,000 barrels of water planned to go through those types of facilities. What they intend to do with those facilities is just take water that has been used in the drilling process, put it in one of these facilities, reuse it after the particulates, the things that can't be put back down in the well are evaporated out or settled to the bottom of the pit, and then they send that water back to be used in the well. As well as this is a great way to get rid of water. They use it, they put it in these pits, it evaporates over time. You can continually put barrels of water into these pits and dispose of it that way. In concert, we often see disposal wells come along with these, and disposal wells are nothing new to the state of Wyoming nor the state land office. We do have those across the state as well. I apologize I didn't put that in the summary, and we probably should have, but that's another way that the industry has found to dispose of the water that's used in the drilling process that cannot be returned back to the surface or for some other beneficial use. These disposal sites, these water treatment facilities, have the wells that come along with them, and we charge a per barrel fee for the use of those disposal wells. The second thing I want to highlight very quickly, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that may come along, is the market analysis that the director spoke about. Each and every long-term lease, every real estate transaction has an appraisal that goes along with it to determine what that market rate is. The requirement to do that on every single lease is given to us by rule. That rule tells us that we must first look at what the applicant might offer as far as an annual fee or rental to use that land. And then we are to go out and find any comparables that we can to determine if that offer is the market rate. And as you're aware, very well aware, that finding information in the private world is extremely difficult. Those leases have confidentiality clauses within them. We can't necessarily use those a lot of times to determine what the market rate is. So we're left with looking at our internal database. In that market analysis that I shared with Senator Boner, it does have a bracketed list of all of the other uses on state trust land for that particular market analysis that was used to determine the fair market value. And if there aren't a lot of uses currently on state trust land, then we also go and look at our federal partners if there are similar uses on BLM or Forest Service lands, which are often the case. They manage very similarly to us. And we try to see what they're charging and how that would compare to the use we're also looking at. And lastly, the rule states that if we can find no comparables looking in those two places, that we are to do a market analysis of the land itself, determine its value, and charge a rate of 5.5% annually for that use. Rarely in these types of situations do we go to that level. Having a bracket of 5 to 10 other pits across the state of Wyoming appears to be sufficient enough to determine a market rate. And so we often use that. The other requirements that come along with an applicant who wants to do a water disposal site on state land is that they must reach out to the existing surface lessee if there's an additional special use lessee, or oftentimes it's the grazing lessee, and get their consent and comment on their use. Now, consent is something that has gotten harder of late to acquire, and it's perhaps that the existing surface lessees are becoming more aware of their ability to address the Board of Land Commissioners. That could be a reason, I'm not sure, but we are seeing a lot more comments back to the board for these applications, and lessees not necessarily granting their consent without further discussion. And so we're meeting that response in a graduated level as it comes in, and mostly we're just trying to be more responsive to that surface lessee so they fully understand our process, what other steps these applicants may have to go through after they secure Board of Land Commissioner approval of a lease or not. So that lessee consent is one requirement. The next is they must provide a legal survey of the site they wish to use. The third is to go through a surface impact payment negotiation with that surface lessee to compensate them fairly for the actual loss and nuisance of this new use being put upon them. And just want to highlight that again, that's a negotiated payment between the new lessee and the existing lessee. And the Office of State Lands only gets involved in that negotiation if a settlement cannot be reached, but only if a settlement cannot be reached. Obviously, we review each and every payment, surface impact payment that comes in to ensure that it meets market, if you will, that somehow industry isn't paying less than it should, and somehow the surface lessee isn't requiring more than it should, but staying somewhere in the market that we can find. The last requirement is that the new applicant must provide an engineer's estimate for reclamation, and also provide a reclamation bond that matches that estimate. There were a lot of talks during the last session about the public comment, the ability for the public to comment on the uses that are coming to the board, like these water evaporative sites. And we don't necessarily have a public process. We want to make sure that the existing lessee has the ability to address the board and give them any comments that they feel are appropriate. And that's simply it. The board also approves these leases in an open public meeting. So I guess a member of the public could approach the board during that time and provide their comments to them. But the process isn't really designed to go out for a 30 or 60 day public scoping or public comment period because it is the Board of Land Commissioners' sole responsibility to put the appropriate uses on those lands. Now, that doesn't mean that the public has lost its right to speak once a lease is approved. That lease only gives access to the site by that lessee. They are not immune from any of the rules and regulations of any other state agency in Wyoming, nor the state statutes. So in the example of a water treatment facility, obviously there's some environmental concern with that use. That lessee, that water treatment facility lessee, must abide by all the rules and regulations of the Department of Environmental Quality, as well as the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Each one of those entities, when granting those regulatory permits, have a public comment process, and the existing lessee on our lands or any other member of the public has the ability to speak to the permit at that point in time. One last thing, going back to the rental, is that every rent, that's assessed, every lease that gets put on the land gets one of those appraisals that I shared with the chairman. Every 5 years, each lease gets another one of those appraisals. So every 5 years, we do a rent review to determine if the use that was contemplated 5 years prior is still the current use that's going on. And we also do a market analysis to determine that the rent that we assessed at that point in time is still appropriate for the use. Additionally, each rental is assessed at escalator per year to match the inflationary pressure that the state of Wyoming would currently be experiencing. So right now that's 2.25%. So every single lease, including water evaporative sites, are increased each year by 2.25% to ensure that that lease is still at the market rate, but it's not losing value to the beneficiaries over time. Mr. Chairman, that's the quick overview. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Alrighty, thank you, Jason, for the information. Committee, any questions? We'll start with Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank Deputy Crowder for getting back to me. I had some questions up on the Snyder Basin parcel that the state owns, and I appreciate that. My question is a 50-year lease. That seems like an awful long time period. I see most of those leases were 25 years. If every 5 years you go back and check and something's wrong, you terminate the lease at that time, and then maybe why the 50-year lease versus a 25-year lease? Thank you.
Mr. Crowder, go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Blake, happy to help on the Snyder Basin issue. That's still an ongoing conversation. Each lease gets set a different term. And within this summary that I provided, each and every one of those ponds have a different surrounding circumstance with them. The rules give us guidance in that we are to only set the length of the lease to the economic life of the improvement. When the engineer's estimate comes back for reclamation, it helps us determine what that economic life of that improvement is. So again, every single one is looked at differently and independently, and I'm happy to go back and look at that specific 50-year one. But somewhere in that analysis, it was determined that the economic life of those improvements could be up to 50 years.
Okie doke, thank you. Further questions, committee, go ahead. Yes, Representative Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crowder. So in your presentation, you said you had 14 active disposals on state lands. How many inactive or permitted looking down the road do you have? And then how do you deal with, say, sites that are permitted but not necessarily going to be used or haven't been used in 5 years, say, in the terms of a company speculating or sitting on a permit?
Mr. Crowder, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is a great question. Doing a search of our internal database, it shows the active leases, meaning these are all ones that have an active lease on them. If there's not a lease on the property, then it would have already gone through the reclamation stages, meaning it's been brought back as close to possible to its native situation, native grasses, native vegetation, and contours brought back to the native way they were. So going back and looking back at inactive leases would mean that that use is no longer there, that it's back to grazing, it's back to something else. So we didn't do that search, and I'm not sure that I could find that information in our database. Also knowing that our database is relatively new, and a lot of that historical data just may not be in there to provide you an accurate picture there. Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, would you mind repeating the second part of your question? Sorry.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crowder, so in the case where there's permits but no well, it's in the case where there would be a disposal well permitted but nothing happening on the surface, how do you dispose of those permits, or how do you handle that, and how many of those cases do you have, or do you think you have, or do you have that ability to look that up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative, for that. I don't think I can give you an accurate number on how many of those we have. Just point back that we have 5 field staff across the state to manage the 3.4 million surface acres that we have. So we don't stay on top of and look at the progress of construction on these leases. We can watch it through the usage fees, which a lot of these have a per barrel charge coming back. And if there aren't any charges, we can understand if they're not actively bringing water into these sites or down the hole. But I will concede that there are likely a fair number of applicants and lessees that are speculating on the ability to bring water in and manage it in an economic way. But in the meantime, they're still making the lease payments to us. And while construction may not be occurring, that original site fee of so many dollars per acre on the actual acre where the facility will be, plus their buffer acres, is still owed and payable. And we still require them to bring that in. And it would be, I think, contrary to our fiduciary responsibility, if we were to watch those payments roll in, not have an acre disturbed, and tell them to stop. As you can see in the summary, that's a significant amount of money that comes in from these leases, in addition to the grazing fees that may be coming off of these properties. So that's not something we've put as a high priority, to look at these leases that actually don't disturb the ground and tell them to stop paying us. I believe there would be a pressure, an economic pressure on them to stop making those payments if they weren't having any revenue coming in on the backside to support them.
Okay, Senator Co-Chairman Bonin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on that, yeah, I appreciate the discussion on the fiduciary responsibility. Obviously, I think one of the biggest revenue sources is, once you do have an active facility, is that per barrel charge. And I'm just looking at least the 2 that you provided in Converse County, that's well below the market rate. I think it's roughly half the market rate, just anecdotally. I mean, it's so I understand the challenge with getting actual information from private agreements that are going to be confidential. So I was just wondering, when it comes to that discussion around the consent of the leaseholder through that process that goes to the SLIB, how much information is available to the current leaseholder? Are the details of the financial agreement available? Because I think that landowner is likely to be involved in development of similar facilities, or they know somebody who is, and might be able to provide some help in that process, to provide some context as to what a market rate actually is. So just wondering if we can go a little bit more detail about what that consent process looks like from the current leaseholder, and what information is available to them, so they might be able to provide some more context.
Jason, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Another great question. So each application that comes in is not the same, and it may not take the same course to reach approval or the same time frame. What the applicant knows is that they must reach out to the surface lessee and provide them with an office approved lessee consent and comment form, and have that returned. That could take a week, a day, it could take many, many months. And we've seen them all over the board. So we put it on the applicant to provide that to the existing surface lessee, And in that, providing that document, we expect them, and I don't know that they could gain consent, we expect them to provide sufficient information of the activity that they are expecting to do, that existing lessee understands what the impact of their current operation would be and what the financial resolution to that should be. And inside of that, I do know that they talk a lot about financials, and that's very specific to the two of those parties negotiating this conversation out. And I don't know what exactly as far as financials are shared back and forth. But I do know that they talk a lot about the loss of grazing, the loss of AUMs, the amount of vehicular traffic, just physical presence of the new use and things like that, and try to match a number to both of those. We are always open to provide any information we can to any of those lessees, and we would provide them with the information that I provided with the committee here, is that we have these uses that are similar in nature. This is what we have charged in the past, and they can make a determination on if there should be similar fees charged on private land, if that's the negotiation that they're in. But none of the information that I've shared with you today is private, and we do share this outside of any application that we receive. So anytime anybody calls us and asks for, what are you guys getting for this particular use? We're happy to provide them that information in hopes that we can gain some good information back to try to get a glimpse into those private markets and understand what they could be charging and how successful they've been.
Do you have a follow-up, Senator? Go ahead.
Maybe I'll give it a shot. I appreciate that response. It helps clarify it for me. And just so I understand, that means that when you look at this handout and that there's discussion of the payments to the lessee, that's determined, I guess that's a result of the process of the potential leaseor potential lessee negotiating, getting consent from the current lessee. Is that correct? So it seems like it's, if I understand it correctly, the process to make sure that the current lessee is compensated for the loss of the grazing ability, but it's not necessarily, the focus isn't necessarily getting the best deal for the state. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman,
Go. Yep,
Senator
go ahead.
Bonner, I think the focus is always to get the best deal for the state. And there's going to be a margin of that, obviously. We're not going to hit that bullseye dead on every single time because we may not know where it is. We do review each one of those payments as they come in to ensure they're within that bracketed range, not something that is a far outlier to the left or to the right, but somewhere in the middle to make sure that occurs. Again, we're not the people on the ground, and so this negotiation is very much tied to how that new use will impact the existing use. And the two best people to have that conversation are the existing lessee and the new lessee, which will move that bar up and down. And I should make a short little comment here about what if they can't reach an agreement. The board's rules are very clear on the process we must take if they can't come to an agreement, or if we notice that the amount reached is outside that bracketed amount. And what we do is very similar to an appraisal. We reach out and we try to understand what others may be getting for similar types of uses. We try to understand values of land. We try to do everything we can to generate as much information as possible, determine what that rate might be. And oftentimes we're just left with our internal database for other uses on state trust land and try to stay as close to the area as possible. We allow each side to give us any evidence that they can to tell us what that market rate should be, and give them a period of time to do that. We bring all that information together. We make a recommendation to the Board of Land Commissioners on where we feel the fair rate for a surface impact payment should be, and then allow the Board of Land Commissioners to make that final determination. So there's always a conversation that goes along with these payments as they're being negotiated to whatever level is needed.
Okay. All right, we have a question first from Representative Simpson, and then we'll go to Representative Clausen, but Representative Simpson, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a couple of questions for Mr. Crowder, if I could. The handout that your department has given to us, it's in our packet today. The first page is a summary that describes 14 sites, and then the next page begins to what appears to be the in-depth information about each of those 14 sites. Mr. Crowder, do you have that in front of you?
Mr. Chairman, I do.
I'd like to,
Go ahead.
let's look at the very first one, SU 227, if I could, please. I can follow all the way down through there, the different pieces of information that you've shared with us, until I get to the third to the last line, and then the second to last line. Am I to assume those two numbers are specifically regarding the evaporation ponds? And if so, what is the state's share? How does that tie in?
Mr. Crowder, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Simpson, that's a great question. So our surface impact payments are split up based on the amount of surface impact payment negotiated, and that's per rule. So anything $0 to $5,000 is split 60-40. 60% coming to the state, 40% remaining with the lessee. When you get over $5,000 to $10,000, I believe, it's split 70-30. And then anything over $10,000 is split 80-20. 80% coming to the state, 20% going to the lessee. So again, it's always, or all of these rules are written to be in the state's best interest. The lessees are negotiating on our behalf. We're hoping they're doing a great job. We want to keep that negotiation at that level because those are the two parties that will come up with the best solution as far as payment. However, we do take the majority of that payment for the beneficiaries because it is the beneficiary's land that this use is being operated on.
So let me
Follow up, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, let me make sure I understand that then. So in this particular application of number 227, $1,651 is transferred to the leasee. Are we talking the grazing leasee, or who is the leasee there that receives that $1,600?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. Yes, that is correct. I should have went into depth there. The lessee would be the state's grazing lessee. That's 99% of the time. There could be existing special use lessees as well, but 99% of the time, lessee means the existing grazing lessee. And in this case, they would have received $1,651.
So Mr. Chairman, then, so two lines above that, so the grazing leasee is paying $1,884 to the state for the grazing rights, and then he receives $1,651 from the energy company. Question mark.
Jason, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great point to talk about. Oftentimes, our surface impact payments are one-time payments for the duration of the lease. Sometimes they've been negotiated to be annual payments. So obviously, annual payments would be lower in concept than a one-time payment. Also, a surface impact payment is not intended to simply replace the acres or the AUMs that are being taken away by this new use. It's also intended to compensate for the nuisance of this new use. If grazing lessees need to change their cattle operation or something similar to that, they need to be compensated for the nuisance as well. So that's why there's not a direct one-to-one relationship.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. That helped me a lot. So the above numbers are annual and the below numbers are a one-time number. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, thank you, Representative. I think we had one from Representative Clausen. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Crowder. So when one of these facilities is transferred, the ownership is transferred from one company to another, how do you go about transferring a lease? Do they have to resubmit their lease, or how do we go about that?
Jason, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great question, Representative Clausen. It is a simple assignment of lease process we go through. So in order for it to be a simple name change, they provide us with an application form. We call it an assignment form. We provide that to the Board of Land Commissioners for ultimate approval. At the point we get that form and before we provide it to the board for approval, we do go into that lease and ensure compliance on all sides. So we ensure that the bond is appropriate to cover reclamation. We ensure that all payments have been made, that the lease is just in compliance before we recommend approval to the Board of Land Commissioners for that. That's just for a name change. If that new entity wishes to do anything new on that lease or anything less, then we will do a rental review at that time to determine if a different rent should be assessed on the property. As well, if that new use exceeds what the original surface impact payment was intended to cover, then we'll require a new surface impact payment at that time. However, if it's just a simple name change, that's all it is a simple name change, and the lease goes on in its normal fashion.
Okay, thank you. Committee, further questions for Mr. Crowder? Yes, follow up, Representative Clausen, go ahead.
Not really follow up, but another question. Based on your fair market analysis, I maybe point out a flaw in the methodology, but if you only use your own numbers that are based on your own numbers for a fair market value evaluation, and there's no injection of anything from anywhere else, that the number is most definitely going to stay the same over time and not necessarily representative of the fair market value or an analysis that might be out there in the private market. More of a comment than a question, or wouldn't you agree, or is there something I'm missing?
Mr. Crowder, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, I think that's a very fair point to bring up, one that we've recognized within the office. We are very limited in the amount of information that we can gather. Our appraisers do a great job of going out there and beating as many trees as they can to try to see if they can have any fruit that falls. And sometimes they're lucky and they do get some. The BLM is a great resource for information as well, but again, they are as limited as we are as far as information. So we're borrowing and sharing the same information back and forth. I think it's best regulated by the offers that we receive from these companies. There are, as my summary will show you, there are a lot of different companies that come in over time, Expedition being the one most of late that has come in and applied for leases, and I apologize for using their name, but they're a brand new player to the game. And so they want to be successful. They want to carve out their niche there on our land and in that area of the county. And they're going to offer us something that will allow them to do that. So while we may not know how that fits on adjacent private land, we know that that's a new player in the game trying to get into it and desiring to be successful. So we assume that they are offering us something similar to what they're offering the adjacent private.
Okay. Go ahead, Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, just one more question. So what do you have for oversight to make sure that the sites are actually being taken care of? An issue up here is that if the disposal is closed, we've had cases where somebody in a hurry will dump production water on the roads and things like that. Do you have any oversight as far as that goes, or does that belong to the leasee?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, no, the responsibility obviously lays with the new lessee, the water treatment facility lessee. It's been a great relationship that we have with the grazing lessees, that they raise that to our attention. They're the best stewards of our land, and a lot of them do raise these things to us. And then we start the watching process, if you will, to understand what the infraction is. But all of these water treatment facilities that we're speaking about here do have an environmental concern impact, and that they do have regulatory requirements and permit regulations that they're required to be under. So the DEQ is watching them as well. Our field inspectors, once we are aware of a situation, work in concert with the DEQ or the OGCC inspectors to determine what the infraction is and how to remedy it.
Okay. Anything further from Representative, I see one from Senator Bonner, Mr. Coach.
Oh, sure. And then it looks like Senator Case wants to say something too. Just like to welcome him to our Joint Ag Committee. Glad that he's here. And obviously we have, they have a very similar topic dealing with state lands. So appreciate his presence. Will be coordinating hopefully as we both kind of tackle this different sides of the similar issue. But yeah, I guess that Representative Clausen did get at the other part of, I think part of my concern at least is the accountability for environmental concerns, especially considering disposal pits, which in just my opinion is probably the most hazardous part, at least from I guess a landowner's perspective. It not just the production water, it's salt water, which is of course going to be hugely detrimental to vegetative growth and on that side for a considerable amount of time, decades if not longer. So just a little bit more discussion, because I can tell you that if it's on a private land and somebody is caught doing what Representative Clausen described, the response is immediate. You don't kind of have a secondary thing where we're going to start watching at that point. The offending party is immediately held accountable. And I just want to understand, Mr. Crowder, keep in mind that, and he said it very, very, I think to the point, there's 5 folks at OSLI who are supposed to be covering the whole state. I'm sure DEQ isn't much better, and we do rely on the landowners, the lessees to for that accountability. So I'm just wondering if it is a 2-step process. Once there's an issue, then they start watching instead of more immediate and direct response to those clear violations of environmental standards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Senator Bonner, for that. Yes, we do want to be as responsive as possible. Understanding that those 5 guys driving around the state aren't as specialized as the DEQ or whatever other regulatory body may be in charge of that. So it is, I think, very important for the 2 groups to work together. And I would imagine that the same environmental regulations apply to the private land as they do the state trust land. So as immediate of a response as you can get on private land, that's what we can get on state land as well. But it would be through those environmental regulatory entities, those agencies. So we do have a very quick response in that we pick up the phone and we talk to the lessee who has the infraction against them or the allegation. And we try to understand what is happening. While we may not have been on the ground to see it, that's probably about as quick as it can go. We can tell them that there's been a concern raised, that we're going to work with DEQ to try to remedy the situation. But it's the same response that you would have on private land, other than our 5 guys probably weren't driving down the road and saw it at the same time.
Follow up. Go ahead.
Okay, good to hear that. Mr. Chairman, just says, is there been any fines assessed recently or some form of payment for any known violations of those environmental standards on state trust land that we can look to?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bonner, thank you. I don't know of any of those off the top of my head or the exact amounts, and I'm happy to work with DEQ to see if there are some. We have worked with DEQ on violations in the very recent past. And it's not necessarily on state trust land, but neighboring state trust land where we may have a concern. But I'm happy to work with DEQ and understand if they have levied fines on uses on our lands.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I see Senator Chairman Case has some input he'd like to provide. So Senator, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First off, let me just thank you for inviting me to this meeting, and I'm glad to be here. It's related to a topic Revenue Committee has as well, so I'm grateful to you and the entire committee and witnesses and everybody. Thanks a lot. It's an interesting topic. I'm not sure I know a lot about it, but I do have a couple of questions. I understand the problem of having comparables and a lot of private deals. You're not able to get the information, and that certainly makes sense. I wonder how we could improve that and know a couple of things. I wonder if it's problematic that surface leasees could potentially earn more money off of this more than their opportunity cost lost from the grazing fees. Maybe that's an issue, maybe that's not. I'd like to think about that some more. But I'm really wondering if we are accounting for long-term effects from these facilities, kind of the opportunity cost. And I think that Co-Chairman Boner kind of nailed it, that if the ground in the future isn't as productive, have we accounted for that? The fact that under any standard of reclamation, it doesn't quite measure up to the productivity that it was before, even under a long, long time. We've certainly lost a lot. The grazing leaseholders have lost a lot. It might make the lease more undesirable. So how do we feel that we're accounting for that? And how do we account for the fact that we might have one expectation about what the reclamation might look like, and that the actual reclamation falls short, maybe because of salt or something? Sorry, there's a lot of questions. I really appreciate the chance to be here, and thanks to all of you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Case. That is a great question, and it's an analysis that we go through each and every lease that we put in front of the Board of Land Commissioners. Understand these lands are assets of trust beneficiaries, and there's a fiduciary responsibility that comes along with that. And so the most prominent use of our lands is grazing, and we want to make sure that that operates in the most optimal manner possible, but simply to derive revenue in a sustainable way. So that's why we place animal unit month designations on each property to make sure that they're not overused and can be used for the next 138 years of statehood. We do that analysis with these leases as well. We understand that there is an environmental impact with these. There's an environmental impact with oil wells being put on our land, and that's hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue to the state. So we do the cost benefit analysis, that can we put in enough safeguards, environmental safeguards, to ensure that we can pull those barrels of oil out of the ground, at the same time generating revenue for the beneficiaries, and have a way to clean up any messes that may occur. And we do that through bonding, and we do that through partnerships with the DEQ and the OGCC and the state engineer's office as well. So when we look at these, we see those experts telling us that a certain amount of money can clean up a problem if it occurs. Now, again, my office wouldn't have the expertise to understand all the ins and outs of that, and we rely on that relationship with those that have the expertise. So having that information under our belt, we then look at this property, this asset of the beneficiaries returns, in Representative Simpson's example, $1,800 a year back to the beneficiaries. If we were to allow commercial use, such as a water evaporative site, we're returning over $12,000 a year. So that's a much higher mark and a much higher benefit to the beneficiaries, knowing that the environmental piece is somewhat covered, the revenue generation piece is now covered. Then we move forward with that process. Reclamation back to grazing lands, once these are done, and understanding that hopefully all environmental concerns have been cleaned up by the experts that have told us that it could be, it may not be the same. It obviously wouldn't be the same. You've disturbed soil, you disturb the structure of the soil and how it can intake and hold water, and then what kind of vegetation you grow out of it. So that will all change. And I guess our office understands that by having double, triple, quadruple, or even higher returns in a fiduciary way without harming the ability for some kind of grass to grow, while it may not be the same AUM, it is an AUM that can grow. That's the analysis that we do, using our partners as much as we can and leveraging every point that we can to move forward and do this in a sustainable way. That's very important to us. We've been around for that hundreds of years. We want to do this again, and we don't want to have managers or users of our lands 50 years from now being harmed by the decisions that we're putting in front of the board now.
Follow-up, Senator, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Is there any chance I get a look at a couple of those analysis and just kind of see how it's done, and discount rates and how long you're looking at? And, you know, I'm an economist after all. I like numbers, so appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. I'm happy to provide that to you, Senator Case. I don't know if you caught the first part of my discussion, but each lease is also assessed an annual escalator to match
Yes.
with inflation as we have it. So we may not be looking at discount rates specifically, but that escalator is intended to keep us close.
And Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I did hear from the beginning and I appreciate it.
All righty. Committee, further questions for Mr. Crowder? Yes, Representative Clausen, go ahead.
Mr. Crowder, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Crowder, this is not on the disposal well issue, but more on the freshwater sales. How does the state handle freshwater wells permitted for like very large deep water uses? How do you guys handle that as far as for commercial scale?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen. That is another great question. We handle it in just about the exact same way, knowing that we don't own the water. Actually, the beneficiaries don't own the water. The state of Wyoming does. So the way we assess that rent is by how much activity a certain well will get to pull that water out. So we will charge on a per barrel basis, but it's not that we're selling the water. We're simply trying to understand how much activity is at that site where they're pulling the water out. But very similar to this, we have a site fee for it. We charge on a per barrel, and I believe that I don't have that in front of me, and I apologize, but it's about $40 to $50 a barrel to be sold. A surface impact payment is also negotiated. Bonding is required. All the same steps that I went through are required there. It's just the rates are higher, and it's based on the per barrel pulled out.
Follow-up, go ahead.
And one more, I apologize for so many questions. Then pipelines and those sort of surface damages, how does the state handle, let's say, water inlet pipelines to a water disposal? The fields are so much different now than traditional in gas, where there's literally miles and miles and miles of poly pipe and right-of-ways and gas right-of-ways. How's that handled?
Mr. Chairman, another good question, and it's handled very much on a case-by-case basis, because as you mentioned, each field is just a little bit different, and each field has its own age and how they have handled it in the past. So we have a variety of vehicles available to us to manage those situations. One is obviously an easement, and that is really dependent on how long that pipe will be there, how far it has to travel, and how far away the lease is that it's benefiting. If it's benefiting state trust land or somebody else's lease. If everything is close and tidy, and there's not a lot of ownership between our state lease, if it is ours, or what have you, with our facility on the ground, our treatment facility on the ground, we can roll it into one of these special use leases as well and charge on a linear rod basis. We also have the ability to put a temporary permit on the ground to allow that for that type of use, and that's for anything less than 5 years, very short duration in nature. But again, all of those uses go through this exact same process. Every single one is market analysis is given to it. Even in the easement situation, every single one has a surface impact payment owed against it. Every single one is reviewed depending on the actual situation that we permit.
Okay, thank you. Committee, are there any further questions for Mr. Crowder? Further questions for Mr. Crowder in the State Land Office? Sounds like a band. But, okay, well, Jason and Jennifer, thank you for your time today. And if you can, stick around for just a little bit longer till we get through this, but if anything else comes up, but certainly appreciate your testimony and your help here today. So thank you very much. For as far as our list of folks up to testify today, we've got stock growers and the Farm Bureau, but in deference to Senator Case, if he has anything further to add, because he is also on the list to testify as a member of Joint Revenue, I would turn it over to him. And so, Mr. Chairman, if there's anything further you'd like to add, please feel free.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to listen to the public comment on this issue if you can. It's, revenue, in my memory, we haven't circled back with state lands in a long time. So it's on our interim study and we have a long ways to go. So I'm not going to tie up all your time with what I don't know. I'd really like to listen to your witnesses with you, and then I'll sign off after them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. No, thank you again for joining us today. Okay, well, that being said, we'll jump back to Mr. Magagna and stock growers. So Jim, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to offer a grazing lessee, primarily perspective on this issue. As you can well see from the information that's been provided by Mr. Crowder, that historically this was not much of an issue. There were a few of these out there. They were relatively small. It's been over the last 10 years, and even more so perhaps the last 5, that the demand for these types of facilities has increased significantly, and the challenges that go with it, of course, have also. And I would begin by saying we certainly recognize this as a potential significant source of revenue to the State Land Trust, and have no objections and feel, in fact, that they need to pursue that source of revenue. But there are a couple of things that arise as a result of what's been happening now. First of all, as you see from the payments, the grazing lessee, unless they were somehow able to negotiate otherwise, most often receives a one-time payment. Some of those are a little more significant, some appear to be relatively insignificant. And the state's interest in this is really not so much in that one-time surface impact payment as it is in the ongoing lease payments that it's going to receive for such a large period of time. So that brings several questions to my mind, perhaps some of which can be addressed by the State Land Office. Mr. Crowder mentioned that getting consent is getting harder to get. That's understandable. We're hearing more from grazing lessees who have concerns as the size of the parcels of land that are being impacted has gotten larger than it was in the past. As we talk about 25-year leases, potentially 50-year leases, and could go theoretically as high as 75-year leases, then the ongoing impacts are greater. So in terms of the consent, I noticed in the Chapter 5 rules of the Board of Land Commissioners that the only requirement is that the grazing lessee receive 20 days of notice. I'd be interested in knowing if they're being given considerably more time, or if that's the only requirement in terms of notice and a period of negotiation that is being required by the Land Office before they will step in because the parties have failed to reach a negotiated settlement. I think that one's particularly important. Another concern would be interested in, as some of these become larger, over 100 acres and over that length of period of time, they can significantly reduce the number of animal unit months of AUMs that are available on that parcel of state land. Has the State Land Office been approached by grazing lessees to adjust their AUMs based on these, or would they be amenable to making those adjustments if the request were made by the grazing lessee, where they're going to have a measurable amount of less forage available for their livestock for such a lengthy period of time? I think those are some of the smaller items, but items that certainly deserve to be addressed. And what we would really like to see come out of this is an equitable way that the position of the grazing lessee can be treated fairly, and that their negotiating position can be strengthened. Because I would be the first to say, if I were sitting in the position of the Office of State Lands, and I actually sat there once, why, if I'm looking at a lease that has the potential over 25 years to bring in several $100,000, I'm not going to be a tough negotiator on the amount of a surface lease agreement that's only a few $1,000s of one-time payment. So it seems that it's not entirely right that the grazing lessee has to rely on the Board of Land Commissioners to set that surface use payment unless there's been really adequate and thorough attempt for meaningful negotiation and some indications that the companies have negotiated in good faith. And I think back to surface use on split estates, surface use agreements with the Oil and Gas Commission. There's a very clear process for the surface owner to appeal, to go through the court system if they're not being treated fairly. In this case, we're not talking about the surface owner, but we're often talking about grazing lessees that have been on there for well over a century and whose ranching operations can be severely and permanently impacted by the outcome of how these lands are used. So being able to measure some of those long-term productivity impacts and adjust grazing leases accordingly would be another item that we think would be very important. Finally, I would say there's one other issue that's very important to us, and it may be beyond the scope of what you're looking at today, but I would encourage that the committee take a look at it at an appropriate time. Again, historically, the water that was put in these pits, it was evaporated. Increasingly, maybe it's being used for fracking on new wells. They can allow some of the materials to settle out and then they can reuse it. But the other thing that's come on the horizon just very much in recent years and perhaps the last year or two, and that is that there are now viable processes to clean this water for other uses. And in fact, we at Wyoming Stock Growers are involved in a program with a partner to clean wastewater from these wells and apply it on either croplands or pasture land in appropriate measures and with appropriate measurements and of what's in it and the quantities to increase forage production. That raises the question, the water resulted from the well drilling, and it's the state's water, but who and in what relationship should the various parties have the right to use the water for other than well drilling purposes? Does the state have an economic interest there that would entitle them to some benefit? Does the grazing lessee potentially, or does a neighboring landowner, if that water was in fact produced from wells on that neighboring land? It's a rather complex issue, but it's one that I think we ought to be in the forefront of today and begin to start to sort that out before it ends up in front of the courts to be sorted out. So with that, Mr. Chairman, in the interest of your time, I would be happy to take any questions that the committee may have.
All righty, thank you, Mr. McGagnon. Committee, are there any questions for Jim? Any questions? Going once, going twice, okay, all right, thank you. Mr. McGagnon, thank you for your testimony and your comments today. And we may possibly circle back, but for now, we'll go on to the Farm Bureau and Mr. Moline. Brett, you have the floor, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau. As a question to Mr. Crowder, as Mr. McGagnon pointed out, that some of these disturbances are getting up to 100 acres. Well, on a school section, that's a sixth, and they get that one-time payment. But is there an ability to renegotiate the grazing lessee's lease to reflect the lower ability, the lower amount of production?
Mr. Crowder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of great questions there. And we'll start with the last one, if you don't mind, by answering one of the first ones. So we don't change a grazing lessee's lease as far as which acre is involved in it, regardless of the additional use that may be put on top of it. And that's for one reason. And that is once we take that acre out of that grazing lease, by rule, it's no longer tied to a grazing lease, or otherwise it's called vacant. And that grazing lessee is no longer tied to it, or no longer receives the benefit of a preferential right to get it back. So once the secondary use is gone and reclamation has been deemed appropriate and we're able to put grazing back on the property, it's a piece of vacant land, meaning it has to go through the vacant land process, the open public bidding process, and that existing lessee, however far back that was, no longer has the ability to match a bid, really has no rights. He's just that member of the public like anybody else bidding on it. So we've intentionally left those acres in that lease to ensure that that existing lessee, no matter how long the secondary use may occur, that existing lessee maintains his rights to that acre and can continue grazing once the secondary use is pulled off of it. The surface impact payment is intended to cover the, partially is intended to cover the payment paid to the state. In Representative Simpson's example of special use lease 22-7, that $1,800 annual payment to the state is the whole lease. We didn't break it down on just the acres that were involved in that water treatment facility. It's the whole lease. So I need to pull that back up on my screen to tell you that was only a couple acres in that example, if I remember right. An $1,800 surface impact payment on a couple acres. If we were to drill down and look at the actual AUM or productive nature of that acre, we would see that he's fairly compensated over a long period of time as far as what he's being paid, or the state, on that AUM. I also want to reach back, Mr. Chairman, if I can, to Mr. McGagne's question about the surface impact payment notice process. Thank you. The rules are very clear in what we do if we can't reach a resolution. And I want to be clear to the committee that there is a lot of work that goes on prior to us reaching into the rules and using that as guidance. We require each new lessee to go through that good faith negotiation to try to reach that rate. And once they come to us and tell us we simply cannot find a resolution to this problem, we respond to them in writing and say, you're going to give it a good try for the next 60 days. And we're going to put everything on hold for 60 days and allow these two parties to come up with a resolution. We also, at that point, give them the requirements that we would use if the board had to make the determination on an appropriate rate, meaning that provide all the evidence that you can to show each party as well as us what the market is and should be, and show evidence of that correspondence going back and forth, so that if at the end of that 60-day period there still is not a negotiated amount of resolution, we have all the information we need to start that 20-day process. And that's when the notification per the rules occurs, and that's when we start bringing the board into the situation. But there are several attempts to make sure good faith negotiations occur prior to using that provision in the rules in that 20-day time period.
Alrighty, thank you, Jason. Mr. Moline, do you have any further questions or comments?
No, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thank you. Yes, Mr. McGagne, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, if I might just ask for one clarification from Mr. Crowder. I believe Mr. Moline, but I don't want to speak for him. I was not asking for any adjustment or removal of acres. I was inquiring as to the potential to adjust the animal units, keeping all the acreage intact, but recognizing that there's less forage available for the length of that permit.
Mr. Crowder, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McGagn, that's a great clarification, and I apologize, I went down a different road. Again, we're assuming that the surface impact payment covers that cost of that AUM. If I can think back to an example of a coal mine that comes through a parcel of state land, we have at times adjusted that amount if the coal mine remains in place for a long period of time. And that's taking over the whole parcel, or at least 90+% of it. So there have been times where we've done that activity, but again, we need to do an assessment of what the surface impact payment was, how did that compensate, and what did it compensate the surface lessee for before we would make that move.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Senator Case, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I was just trying to put myself in the position of a grazing leaseholder, and maybe it's a lease that's been part of a ranch for a long, long, long time. We've counted on it, and then we're kind of forced into trading a one-time payment for really an unknown future. We don't know how long that thing's going to be there. It could be 25 years, I guess, if I understood correctly. And then afterwards, we don't know what its productivity will be and when it comes back to productivity. Yet we have to accept an upfront compensation for that. That's kind of a one-time deal. And yet the Staff of State Lands, who's really our partner in this, they get ongoing payments, as I understand it. So I think that's a difficult decision for a lessee to make as to what the trade-off is. Well, I feel for him. Question mark. Do I have that right?
Oh, Jason, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Cakes. I think you've characterized it appropriately. What I will say is that each acre has a value, and it has a value to that grazing lessee that has the lease on it. If we put a secondary use that stops their ability to use it in the near term right after that lease, it still has a value to that lessee. And I think that I could probably expand on my conversation with Mr. Magagna to say, while the AUMs may not be reduced, we do want to make sure that acre that the AUM is derived from is still available to that lessee. And there is a value there. Our current AUM rate is $5.88 per AUM. And so I can't point to anything in writing, just my own experiences, but to pay $5.88 to make sure that that acre is available to you and you will have a leg up in the competition if that were to occur after that secondary use was there, I think that is an asset that the beneficiaries should benefit from.
All righty. Thank you. Okay, further questions for Mr. Crowder? And if there's not any right off the bat, we'll go ahead and also include Travis and the Petroleum Association in this conversation if he's still on with us. Oh, and Mr. Obermuller is here as well. Hello, Pete. All right, with either of you gentlemen, we'll start with Travis and Petroleum Association, but go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to defer to my, it's Travis Deti with the Mining Association. I'm going to defer to Pete to go first.
Okay. Mr. Obermuller, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Travis. Appreciate that. Pete Obermuller, President of the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today. This has been an interesting discussion, and it's gone in some directions that were a little bit unexpected, and frankly involves some unsubstantiated claims of concern that will have to be further discussed as we move forward. But Mr. Chairman, from my standpoint, what I want to talk about is the experience of my members with respect to how these leases operate, and in fact, what the revenue to the state from these particular leases. And so to do that, I'm going to share my screen real quick. I just have one slide, so I won't overwhelm you with it. But I wanted to point this out as a matter of comparison. And just to point out at the outset that none of this is a value judgment. These are numbers from 2019. These are actual revenue to the state of Wyoming from state lands and from other sources as it relates. So you can see that in 2019, oil and gas accounted for almost 125 million to the state. Mostly in the Common School Fund, but there's lots of other sources which Jason could describe, Mr. Crowder could describe if you wanted him to. Accounts for 64% of all the revenue that comes from state lands, and grazing leases account for 3%. None of this happens in a vacuum, Mr. Chairman. Most of the discussion today has sort of, I think, a disinterested listener could be forgiven for thinking that this discussion, that somehow all of this happens in a vacuum and only on state lands, and that the state lands are not surrounded by, in many cases, private lands where the private lessee who is operating on state-owned land also has their own private service use agreements and their own private arrangements with industry next to those lands or surrounding them or in other areas. And so this is why I bring up the 29 assessed valuation value and assessment ratios. While this is not state land, this is property tax writ large. I think it's important to point out that when we're talking about school funding and constitutional responsibilities of school funding and making sure that we maximize that amount, I want to posit for the committee that when we're talking about an 100% assessment ratio and 64% of state lands revenue, I'm not sure that maxing out on those is necessarily the right approach. Mr. Chairman, if you take a look at that, you can see that, you know, the productive value in 2019 and assessed value in 2019 for a state assessed, which is minerals, $11.3 billion, no difference between the two, and 100% of the assessment ratio. The others, of course, vast differences between the assessed value and the productive value and what is taxed there. I point that out again because all of this is none of these things can be taken as individuals. These are all part of a regulatory and tax environment in Wyoming that is frankly very expensive related to our competitive states. So, Mr. Chairman, overall on oil and gas property taxes, oil and gas paid almost $497 million. It's 40% of all property taxes paid in Wyoming. And remember that property taxes, about 78% of those goes to schools. And oil and gas pays about 40% of that. And 70% of the mineral taxes, of all minerals property taxes paid, is paid by oil and gas. So, Mr. Chairman, it's just important to me and to my members that we have a clear-eyed understanding of the level of taxation in Wyoming, and that includes the leases and royalties that Mr. Crowder talked about and that are paid on an annual basis by the oil and gas industry. And so to the extent that the discussion today is trying to figure out how to increase that, how to quote unquote maximize that, I simply offer a note of caution that when we talk about the Powder River Basin and the oil, particularly the oil that is accessible in the Powder River Basin, this is high quality product, it's desirable product, and it's product that we want to be able to produce, our members want to be able to produce and deliver to consumers, and that provides an enormous amount of revenue and jobs to the state of Wyoming. But my members and others don't have to be here. And to the extent that we continue to find ways to quote unquote maximize revenue in these ways, when we're already paying a lion's share of it, that concerns me, Mr. Chairman. So I want to make sure that we recognize a couple of things with regard to reclamation. My members have an extraordinary track record on reclamation. And as was mentioned, we are governed by several laws, rules, and regulations from OGCC and DEQ with regard to reclamation. And those are long-term and in many cases can be shown to produce results that are in fact better than before. So this is, examples can be found on both sides, of course, but to categorize it as the impact always ends up at the end of the day negative and worse, I don't think is necessarily fair or accurate. Secondly, as I mentioned before, these don't happen in an isolated way. So a leasee might get a one-time payment for service use agreements on the part of land that they have leased that is state-owned, yes. But those service use agreements also take place around there for their own private benefit. And when we talk about market rates and market competition, it gets very complicated very fast. And I would confidentiality has already been talked about, but I would argue that that in many cases, the surface use agreements and payments made to private landowners, particularly in the Powder River Basin, are well above what market rate would be, and in fact is an increasingly expensive and alarming part of doing business in the Powder River Basin. Mr. Chairman, I would argue that their split estate laws are in fact already in a lot of ways tilt in one direction, and my members don't feel like it's in their direction. So I know that Mr. McGagna and others would disagree with that, which means that perhaps we are at an equilibrium, and simply would caution that we don't again make it more expensive for my members to get up off their knees and begin to produce again in the Powder River Basin, which our budget and our economy and our hardworking men and women in Wyoming need for jobs. I appreciate the time, Mr. Chairman. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Pete, for your for the presentation and for that information. Committee, any questions for Mr. Obermuller or Mr. Detaille? Yes, Co-Chairman Boner, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just like to state I agree with Mr. Obermuller and probably with Mr. Detaille too, not to put too many words in his mouth, that we are way too reliant on fuel extraction, fossil fuel extraction for our revenues. I think everybody understands that. And that's why, at least from my perspective, we've worked pretty hard to reduce, especially the severance taxes in the case of uranium, as one personal bill of mine, and certainly a strong supporter of the work that we've done with oil and gas, those as well. So I'm not disagreeing with anything Mr. Obermuller said. In fact, I think a lot of us can count ourselves as trying to help the oil and gas industry and reducing that regulatory burden, because we do realize it is pretty unique. That being said, I think we do have an obligation to kind of understand if the process is adequate to, and what I would imagine is a relatively small piece of the pie here when it comes to overall how much we literally extract out of the extractive industries from the state level. And I think that we still have that fiduciary responsibility to maximize that revenue when it comes to state lands. If it makes anybody feel any better, the Revenue Committee is going to be looking at a similar consideration when it comes to grazing leases. So I think the legislature overall isn't, I think, picking sides one way or the other. Obviously, they didn't really want the Ag Committee to look at grazing leases on state lands, because they figured that might be a dead end. So that's why Revenue is taking it on, even though we usually oversee state lands. But just wanted to, first of all, voice it. I hope that just because we're talking about this was a piece of the puzzle, certainly not the big picture. Doesn't mean that we're skeptical or wanting to bleed every last cent out of oil and gas or the mining industry overall, and hope that we can acknowledge that I think we've made some improvements in terms of especially the royalty rates recently. So why don't you agree, Mr. Obermuller?
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Go ahead, Mr. Obermuller, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I just appreciate the comments.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I just appreciate the co-chairman's comments. I don't have anything additional to add.
Okay, very good. Committee, further questions for Mr. Obermuller? Further question? Yes, Representative Henderson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess one question comes to mind, kind of in the background related to all this, is what more could we do in the state regarding the concerns expressed? What could we do with regard to the regulations in terms of what that adds to the calculus?
Pete, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Henderson, it's a It's a good question. It's a big question. We could have another entire agenda item to talk about regulations. I think we continually we have a lot of dialogue with the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. In fact, we meet with them every 6 months or so just to get a lay of the land and try to work together. We try to provide information and then vice versa, so that we can try to make sure that our regulations in Wyoming are streamlined as best as possible, and that it's a good place to do business with respect to regulations. We've had very massive changes in the regulations at the OGCC related to split estate and forced pooling over the last year. These were not small changes, these were monumental changes. And both the agency and my members are still working through the aftermath of that, and to make sure that it works for everybody involved. And so, quite frankly, Representative Henderson, as it relates to Wyoming and Wyoming regulations, right now what would be best for us is an opportunity to get back on our feet, an opportunity to, without changes in regulation, without changes in how state lands operates or any of that, that we can come back and get rigs up, to get jobs back, to get the revenue back that we desperately need in this state and at state government.
All righty, thank you. Committee, any further questions? Any further questions? Any further questions from anybody? Kind of a roundtable discussion here in a sense, so a little bit different than what we normally do, but by all means, if Mr. Magagna, Mr. Moline, anybody else would like to jump in with anything, feel free, but
Mr. Chairman?
Otherwise not. Yes, go ahead.
Just want to say, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the way you do it. Usually Chairman Greer is beating me down, so thank you.
I don't think I can measure up to Chairman Greer, so. Anyhow, all right, committee, if there's nothing further, I think that's all of it for what we have on our
Mr. Chairman?
scheduled testifiers, but, oh, yep, I'm sorry, Senator Bouchard, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, it's Travis Detail with the Mining Association. Did you want me to testify on this?
Absolutely, yes, sir, go ahead. My apologies, I'm getting ahead of
I'm
myself.
happy
Go
not
ahead.
to. I could go home if I want. Mr. Chairman, Travis Detail with the Mining Association, and I'd just like to add a little, come at this from a little bit of a different angle. We do mine on state lands. We don't do as much as we do on the federal side of things. But with this issue about the impact payments, I would like to just kind of note for the record that when our operators need to work with a landowner for the mining side of things anyways, I think we generally have a pretty good relationship and a pretty good track record of doing that. Not always, not all the time at all, but generally. And I would just for the record state that we do appreciate and we support that the lessee should receive a fair reimbursement on impact payments. But we do ask that they be fair. And I think that's kind of when we do have rub against each other, it's a matter of whether we think it's fair. And I would say we did have a case several years back where the impact payment that was set was prohibitive for the company. They couldn't pay it. And I think that would lead into what I addressed to the Revenue Committee the other day, is that we're at a point in the state right now with our mineral extraction. In particular, I think uranium is a classic example. We can have all the riches in the ground, unlimited riches in the ground, but unless we can get them out, they're worth zero. They're worth zero to a company, they're worth zero to the state. So we've got to find a way to strike that balance to keep our mineral resources economical to get out of the ground and mine, or else nobody gets anything. So with this particular issue and the impact payments, again, we're not opposed to that at all. I think that it's the right thing to do. When a lessee has to give up some of that land, that they're reimbursed fairly. And I think that's the key as we go forward in this discussion is fairness. With regards to our reclamation, Pete kind of hit on it a little bit, but on the mining side of things, our reclamation is world class, and our goal across the board for my members is to restore land to as good of to better than what it was before. And I think we've got examples in the Powder River Basin with some of our coal operations where you've got grazing started before the second bond has been released. So we want to get it back to that position, and that's our goal. And I think there is a little bit of certainty going forward when these things are being discussed as to how long the land is going to be out of commission, and that's written in a mine plan. So it is there, and so that can be used for planning purposes. And again, my guys take their reclamation very seriously. We do it. We have the best mine reclamation in the United States, and therefore the best in the world. So they take it very seriously, and and that's just part of the way we do business. But I appreciate the opportunity to be invited to the debate today, and some interesting stuff. It's a tough issue, and again, as we look at our revenue picture and where we are right now, I just hope that the committee and then the body in general keep in mind that we're at that point right now, and in the tax debate, and with the mineral industry shouldering the lion's share of the taxes in this state, it's going to be tough to add more. And I don't have an answer. I know Senator Case has asked me what my suggestions would be, and I don't have an answer. But what I would say is that from the extraction side of things, we're at the point right now to where it's going to be very tough to handle additional taxes, revenues, and fees. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you. This is the first time I've come before the Agriculture Committee. So I appreciate you having me here, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your testimony. And committee, any questions for Travis? I guess I have one just off the top of my head for curiosity. Because you did mention that you're more, the industry is more, in operation on federal land than state. But about what is that split?
Oh,
percentage wise?
That's a great question, Mr. Chairman. I don't have that figure for you, but I can dig it up.
Okay. I just out of nothing big, just wondered. Anyway, committee members, further questions for Mr. Detaille? Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, now I think that does, and I apologize for almost missing Travis there, but been a long couple days. But committee, is there any further questions of any of our presenters and guests before we start to wrap up here and see where we want to go next? Yes, Senator Case, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you again. Usually when I come before the Ag Committee, I'm dragging around an in-stream flow bill, and I noticed my reception was a little bit nicer today. But you've always been courteous and good. I didn't mean anything by that but a joke. It was good to see you, and thanks for having us, okay?
Absolutely, Senator. Thank you for being with us, and you're always welcome. So thanks for your time. All right, committee, with that discussion, is there, committee members, does anyone have anything further to discuss, or does anyone like to entertain any motions for consideration? Yes, Senator Bouchard, and then Co-Chairman Bonner.
My computer locked up earlier when we, I was, believe it or not, I was logged on before 2 o'clock, but whatever happened, it all locked up, and I jumped over to YouTube so I could hear that Co-Chair Bonner had brought a motion about the animal rights, and so I would like him to reconsider that again. And I have an interest in that. And like I said, I couldn't. My computer was locked up, and I had to get logged back on. So I'd like to go back there before we end.
Okay, we can certainly revisit that quick. Before we do that, though, would I guess anything anyone would like to discuss from our conversation concerning state lands and these taxation rates and so on and so forth? Yes, Senator Bonner, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I think I'm hoping to refine the point I made a little bit earlier about, it seems like sometimes the ag community and mineral community sometimes butt heads. And I just want to point out and maybe provide a specific example of how maybe we have more in common than we actually think we do. And it's, getting back to that discussion of royalty rates, obviously that's something that's charged directly. A good example is oil and gas. But if you look at to the extent which landowners also own the minerals underneath their property, there's a effect that tax policy has on the mineral owner as well. You look at the differences in royalty rates between, say, a state like Texas that has maybe some similar or even enhanced opportunities for oil and gas development, and the royalty rate you get here, it's about 6% less, as it turns out. So, as we have these broader discussions about the tax burden we levy on our mineral extractive industries, I just point out that it affects more than just them, and I think we have a lot in common, honestly. As folks who, at least the mineral owners that are affected by that tax policy, and so I think, like I said, it's important to reflect on the ways in which we kind of share a common purpose too. So with that being said, I think we do have to. There is a clear disparity here between the market rate and when it comes to these water disposal facilities and perhaps recycling facilities, and on the state lands versus what the going rate is on the market. And I think we have an obligation to try to address that. And there have been some attempts before just to provide the SLIB with as much information as possible and help our state lands office with that barrier that's often erected, and that they can't really get to the these market rates, that they're kind of left without a direct line into that. So I think it's important we get a bill draft going, and I know that there's some folks that have worked on this issue before. I don't know if anybody has a specific suggestion. I'd be open to that right now. So at least we have something to talk about moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Committee members, anybody have any specific thoughts on that? I wish I had some more, some more ideas, more forthcoming out of my head, but I really don't at the moment. This is, I'm a little bit rusty on the issues of minerals and how that relates to state lands, but Representative Clausen, yeah, you bet, go ahead.
Not necessarily, Mr. Chairman, not necessarily a bill draft, but something to look at, especially with this disposal issue, is it's not necessarily adding a burden to the mineral industry. The rates for disposals from a commercial company could very well stay the same, and they simply are paying the state less, and the oil and gas company that's hiring a third-party contractor is just the third-party contractor is profiteering on the state's portion, or what could potentially be the state's portion. I mean, when we get into this, it's not necessarily hanging more taxes or trying to get more revenue out of oil and gas. It's more of a making the system to where it functions properly, and I think maybe that was overlooked by some of others.
Alrighty, thank you. Yes, Co-Chairman Bono, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the challenge often when we deal with state lands is so much is determined in rules and not a whole lot in statute. But I guess I'm more interested in that approval or the negotiation process between the current leaseholder and the prospective leaseholder with in regard to these types of infrastructure. So I wonder if it might be helpful to require some, or specifically ask a question of the current leaseholder if they have any insight into the going market rate of the potential activity when it comes to these negotiations among state lands. I don't know if there's some opportunities there to try to get some insight into what the going rate is in the private for privately held lands.
Okay, thank you. Okay, committee, further discussion or ideas? Going once, going twice, okay. Again, thank you all, everybody, for attending today, and for taking your time out of your busy schedule to be here. And again, thank you, Senator Case, for taking your time to join us. I just kind of like to echo a bit what Senator Boner said. I think that, it's really great. I think that when we can have kind of this cross-reference discussion among committees on some overlapping issues. And frankly, I think that sometimes we sort of forget to do that and we don't do that enough. So, I mean, whether it's with Ag and the Revenue Committee or Ag and the Minerals Committee or, whatever it may be, I think that just, down the road, I think we need to just keep these possibilities and options in mind so that we can have a little bit more, cross interrelation dialogue during the interim. And I think that we all as legislators, individually and as committees, as a whole, can probably benefit from that. But anyway, again, thank you again for your time, Senator, and happy trails, and we'll see you again. Come back soon, anytime. So
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I couldn't agree more with us working together. So you all take care. Safe travels if you're traveling.
All right, will do. Okay, committee. I guess if that's all we have on that, Senator Bouchard, you've mentioned some interest in wanting to revisit the Chairman Boner's animal cruelty bill. Anything in specific you'd like to add to that discussion, or would you like the good co-chairman to recap, or what would you like to do?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that I've talked about how we've kind of gerbled the animal rights section all around. I mean, I think it needs to be something we need to work on. I think we've had testimony on both sides of that in the past, where some people said it's okay. I think it's too ambiguous. And even some of the last, I think 2 years ago, we did some stuff in that section that just doesn't make any sense. But anyway, so I like I said, I couldn't log in, and I think there may be some other interest if we rattle that cage again. So, would you be interested? I'd like to ask.
Co-chairman Boner, I mean, the bill's kind of your baby, so if you want to bring it, if we want to have that discussion, I'll kind of leave that up to you for now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. And I think that, the bill I have is just a cleanup, making the statutes flow a little bit easier. I believe what Senator Bouchard was talking about is maybe a more in-depth working group type thing that would, hopefully address the bigger concerns of why we keep on seeing these these bills coming. It seems like once every year or two, and just think it's best to be proactive and engage with that community and to see what specific concerns they have that could maybe be addressed in a way that doesn't hurt or put at risk production agriculture. So I think I heard Senator Bouchard volunteer to be on a working group, if I understand correctly. Is that correct?
Yeah, I sure would. I'd like to. I guess we have to drum up some more takers on that one, Mr. Chair.
Alrighty, I guess to that point, I would say if Senator Bouchard is interested in that topic, by all means lead the way on that, and whoever else might be interested in further investigating that issue and seeing what they can come up with to improve and clean up those statutes. I don't know if you want to do that formally or informally, Senator, but right now, I guess I would throw that out there. Is any other member of this committee interested in serving on a potential working group for the animal cruelty issue? Show of hands. Okay. Co-chairman Boner, go ahead. You have something?
Oh yeah, I just say I think we could authorize. We don't need a massive working group. I think that if Senator Bouchard wants to take it on, we can. If we want to move to authorize a bill draft and have Senator Bouchard reach out to the affected parties and take the lead on that. And, I can check in every once in a while with that working group and see how it's going. So I can be a quasi member, I guess. But yeah, I think it is important to be proactive, and it's an interim topic that we're assigned. We're not going to be assigned this sort of topic too often. Clearly, I think there was a pretty clear consensus. The only reason we didn't move forward with the working group last time was because we were concerned about our workload, and I think all those concerns have dissipated by now. With we've done the work that we need to for a special session. I hate for the committee to kind of shirk its responsibilities, especially when those circumstances no longer exist. So yeah, I think we should move forward, authorize a bill draft, and have Senator Bouchard take the lead, and have whoever else wants to help can certainly help.
Senator, do you want, Bouchard, do you want anything to add to that or no?
Yeah, I did talk to Representative Larson about this, and I don't know if his video is locked up, or can you see if he's moving over there? I think it looks like it's all locked up. So I think he would have jumped in. Maybe there's something going on there. But anyway, I did speak to him. He showed some interest in it earlier. So
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Yeah, Representative Larson had to leave earlier, about 1 o'clock, I guess. So he's not here at the present time, but I've been listening, and I'll relay this stuff to him.
Okay. That sounds great. I appreciate it, Representative Winter. And I actually was not thinking, because Senator Bouchard's right. The screen is locked up a long time ago, and Representative Larson had texted me that he had to take off quite a while ago. So anyway, thank you, Representative Winter, for holding down the fort there as we wrap up. Okay, committee, I appreciate Senator Bouchard and Representative Larson for having an interest in taking that on. And, as you move forward, keep us in the loop and as to how that develops. But at this time, I don't believe we have anything else before us. So unless there's, go ahead, Chairman, Co-Chairman Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we authorize LSO to work with us.
Yes. Okay. Oh, my apologies. Yep.
Yeah, or not a subcommittee, or working group with Senator Bouchard and Representative Larson. Looks like he's voluntold at some point to reach out to any interested parties that are interested in the legislative process to further strengthen animal cruelty protections. Just work with them on a bill draft and see what they can come up with for our November meeting.
That sounds good. Kayla, you got all that put?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. My only question would be if Chairman Boner, you referenced an individual bill draft from earlier. Have you authorized that as being kind of a starting point, or would you like something different?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it'd be something completely different. I could certainly provide that bill draft to the working group and see if there's if they would like to use it. But I wouldn't necessarily want to tie the work of the group to that particular bill draft necessarily. But we'll be sure to forward it on and see if they can if that'd be useful for them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I have that motion very well then.
All right. So do we have a motion on that? Yes, Co-Chairman Bond. Is that a motion?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Moved by Co-Chairman Bonner. Do I have a second? Second from Senator Bouchard. Okay. Any further discussion? All right. Seeing none. All those in favor of forming the working group, please raise your hand. Okay. And Representative Winter, how do you stand?
Yeah, there's one here.
Okay. Sounds good. So one. All right. Those opposed, please raise your hand. Okay, that motion carries. Working group is hereby created. So, okay. That being said, committee, is there any further business that needs to come before us? And please sing right out, because I may have missed something. So, But if not, I really appreciate everybody's hard work the last couple days. And we'll, I think we put some decent bill drafts together, and we'll see where those go come November. But yes, Senator Boner, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to thank all the folks that worked extra hard, IT staffs in Afton and Powell and here in Douglas, as well as our also IT folks and staff that went the extra mile to ensure that there's plenty of opportunity for public comment with this meeting. And want to thank Representative Simpson and Larson as well for volunteering to help out with that. So looks like we had some input from different corners of the state. So thanks for all your extra work and the good work overall we've done the past 2 days. So.
All right, ditto to that. Yeah, thank you again to Kayla and to Katie for the help on the committee. And yes, thank you in general to the LSO's tech staff for helping arrange all this. I know it's been a little bit hectic, and we'll see what format our meeting takes in November. But anyway, that being said, thank you all again, and we are adjourned. Thank you. Safe travels, everybody.
See y'all. Have a good one.